Hello everyone, it's Patience again. Welcome to another video. This time we're going to look at Yorkshire Coastliner. We're going to look at the history of the operations up to probably around the late 90s, early 2000s. We'll do a little bit after that as well, just to bring the story up to date. This is a spin-off of a model review video that I did of a Creative Master North called Yorkshire Coastliner Volvo Olympian. That one to be specific. I'll put a link in the description to this video to that one. But yeah, explaining that one, normally when I do the first review of an operator, a model in delivery of a particular operator, if it's the first time I've done a bus of that operator, I do a little history of them. But with Yorkshire Coastliner, it got a bit too complicated a bit too quickly. So I thought that I'd do a separate video about Yorkshire Coastliner themselves. So nowadays, Coastliner, as it's known, formerly Yorkshire Coastliner, is part of Transdev Blazefield. And as we know, Transdev Blazefield are pretty good at marketing, it has to be said. The 36 is famous throughout the UK and into Europe as well, I believe. And they've got loads of other brands like, Hotline, Whichway, Mainline, all that kind of thing. Too many to list. But to dispel the myth that some younger enthusiasts might have, the Yorkshire Coastliner name wasn't come up with by Transdev Blazefield, or even by Blazefield before Transdev bought them in 2006. It was actually come up with by the West Yorkshire Roadcar Company, who traded as West Yorkshire when they were part of the National Bus Company way back in the early 80s. So the National Bus Company, up until the 1960s, there have been two big groups, the nationalised Tilling Group and the privately owned BET, British Electric Traction Group. In 1968, BET sold out to the Transport Holding Company and it basically got nationalised. And in 1969, Tilling and BET were amalgamated into the National Bus Company. For the first few years, they allowed their subsidiaries to use the existing liveries. But from about 1972 onwards, they started to put standard liveries in place, white for coaches, and initially the proposal was red with a white band for buses, poppy red. The companies that had always been green, such as Eastern National and Crosville, objected, so it was agreed that a green version of the livery was acceptable, with leaf green as the base colour. For a couple of years there was also blue as well, but there was no standard blue colour. The companies who used blue just used the blue they'd used previously. But then from about 1974 that was outlawed, apart from with Jones of Aberbeeg in South Wales, but we don't need to go into that, that's not relevant to what we're doing. So basically buses were either red or green with a white band. By the early 80s it became obvious that the National Bus Company was going to be privatised in some form or another, and that deregulation was going to come in. And as a result, NBC, the National Bus Company, started to relax the rules on liveries. One of the first relaxations was the Venetian blind livery, which basically consisted of a white base coat with black window surrounds and black skirt, onto which operators could put two colours of their choosing. So to illustrate the livery, we've got this Lincolnshire Roadcar Leyland Olympian at Barton-on-Humber railway station back in the the mid-1980s. As you can see, Lincolnshire Roadcar chose two shades of green, but that was the Venetian blind livery. And you can see it was called that because it had this feature of this diagonal band that with the alternating colours in stripes that looked like a Venetian blind, hence why it got its nickname. West Yorkshire chose two shades of blue for its Venetian blind livery, and it applied the livery to vehicles that were used on Route 843 that had previously been the 43 between Leeds and Scarborough. They were also used on various other routes on the Leeds-York corridor in particular. But that's what the vehicles were used. The first repaints were done in the spring and summer of 1983, and there were Leyland Leopards that were repainted. They had either Willowbrook 003 or Plaxton Supreme bodies. And they introduced a new fleet name for those services. The first new buses to be delivered in the livery, in the Venetian blind livery to West Yorkshire, were some Leyland Olympians in July of 1985. And as you can see, the name they came up with for these services was Yorkshire Coastliner. There's the name and the first of the logos on a West Yorkshire Leyland Olympian, fleet number 1854, delivered in July 1985, registered B522UWW. This is the point I made about them being used on other services as well. This one is on a 746. It's in Hull bus station. It's in the parking area that was known as the Muck, that was just behind the bus station. You can see why it was called the Muck from the state of the surface it's standing on. But the 746 worked from Hull via Beverley, Market Wheaton and Pocklington to York, and then it ran on the York to Leeds corridor in among the 843 that we're talking about, and various other services. So West Yorkshire operated it at the time jointly with East Yorkshire. It later became an East Yorkshire operation of the 746, and it was cut back to run between Hull and York only. But in this era, when this photo was taken, as you can see, West Yorkshire was still running on it, and it was still going through to Leeds because the buses planned up for a 746 to Leeds. But that is where the name came from. West Yorkshire Roadcar Company, back in the summer of 1983, they came up with Yorkshire Coastliner. So the core service of the Yorkshire Coastliner, as we said, was the 843 that had been renumbered from 43 in about the early 80s, I think it was. So the 43 was Leeds to Scarborough via Tadcaster, York and Malton. It was really an ordinary bus route, it wasn't anything special. Some refurbished Bristol RE dual purpose vehicles with high back seats did run on it in the late 70s, early 80s, but they also ran on other things. And generally speaking, the buses used on it were just that, buses. And we've got a beautiful photo here to illustrate the group of routes, really. They're not on the 43 as such, these are on the 46, the one that came from Hull and went to Leeds. But this photo was taken in 1950 in York. Incidentally, most of the photos in this are out of my collection. There's a few that I've taken myself, and there's some that are on Wikimedia Commons that I'll credit separately. But generally speaking, they're from my collection. I don't know who the original photographers were. But this beautiful scene is in York in 1950. The service car, the bus doing the main service run, is an East Yorkshire vehicle, a 1937 Leyland Tiger TS7 with Eastern Coachworks bodywork, and that had dual purpose seats for 32 passengers, so it did have dual purpose seating with higher backs. It's fleet number 311, registered CKH 239. Behind it, and appearing to act as a duplicate vehicle, is West Yorkshire Bristol L5G, also with Eastern Coachworks body, new in 1941. Fleet number 197, registered DWW 602, and that had bus seats for 32 passengers. As you can see, it's got the old Bible indicator, as they call, the big board that's slotted into a holder for the 46 to Leeds. It appears, as I said, to be running as a duplicate vehicle to the East Yorkshire bus. The bus overtaken isn't really relevant to us, but it's a 1935 Bristol GO5G double-decker on a local service in York. But what a lovely shot. I've used this before in one of my East Yorkshire photographic videos. If you haven't checked those out already, have a look on my channel. They're worth watching, I think, if I say so myself. But this lovely photo has been used before in one of those. But yeah, Route 43 wasn't really anything special. At busy times in National Bus Company days, it might be a Bristol low-decker and then later on a Bristol VR double-decker. But generally speaking, it was single-deck work, seemingly, from photographs. Like I say, if you were lucky, a dual-purpose Bristol RE would turn up, but normally it was a bus-seated RE or even a Leyland National. Now, nowadays a 3-hour run on a Leyland National with vinyl seats would be heaven to bus enthusiasts. But back in the 1970s and early 80s, when it was a regular occurrence, it probably wasn't. Just to illustrate the kind of bus that was used on the 43, we see SRG 22, West Yorkshire Bristol RE, with Eastern Coachworks bodywork, registered MWY 719D. It was new in September 1966. It had 54 bus-type seats. The front end isn't a coach front end, that is the original Bristol RE end that the buses had before they standardised on the flat one that they had in the later 60s and then went back to a curved one in the 70s. Some of the journeys on the 43 started back from Bradford or extended to there from Scarborough, and this bus is in Chester Street bus station in Bradford, so it's on one of the Bradford extensions. So the branding of dual-purpose vehicles in the sort of early to mid-80s and the new dual-purpose Leyland Olympians really upgraded the route. You can see fleet number 1853, a Leyland Olympian with Eastern Coachworks body, B521 UWW, again new in July 1985, and it's on the stand in Vicar Lane bus station in Leeds. Vicar Lane was known to locals as the Red Bus Station, and it was still being referred to that when I lived in Leeds in the 2010s. It just shows you can spend a lot of money on marketing and things, but you can't change some things. It's probably not worth changing them, to be honest. Vicar Lane bus station had closed in 1990, and a lot of the buses serving it weren't red for a few years before that. People still called it the Red Bus Station over 20 years later. Most of the stands at Vicar Lane were drive-in reverse out, but the one for the 843 was just a drive-through, and part of the reason for that was that buses tended to come through from Wellington Street coach station on the other side of Leeds city centre. If I can get enough material together, I will do a video about Wellington Street. It was a bizarre little terminus. It was the size of somebody's front yard, but a lot of services. It was a National Express coach departure point for Leeds, and these services, as I say, most of them started from there. As we said, until about the mid-80s, some of them came through from Bradford as well on a daily basis and called at Wellington Street and then Vicar Lane on the way through Leeds. So, deregulation happened in 1986, as we all know. West Yorkshire were privatised in August 1987. They were sold to AJS Holdings, run by Alan J. Stevenson. It was a joint venture actually between AJS Holdings and Parkdale Holdings that bought West Yorkshire. Parkdale took ownership of the depot buildings with a view to selling them off and redeveloping it. It was part of the 1980s property boom. However, there was a clause in the sale contract that said they had to rent the garages back to West Yorkshire for as long as West Yorkshire required them. It's fair to say privatisation was quite turbulent for West Yorkshire. In 1988 it was split up into some smaller units. York City and Districts became operational on the 1st of March 1988. That took over the York services and depot, but it also started running the Malton depot, which is the one that we're most interested in the history of Yorkshire Coastliner. So it took Malton depot and it took operation of most of the route 843 and some of the shorts between Leeds and York, the 744 and the 844 as they were numbered. Harrogate and District became operational on the 1st of September 1988, so by the end of 1988 there were 3 divisions of West Yorkshire that were operating buses. There were some more behind the scenes but they're not relevant to our story. There was West Yorkshire itself, there was Harrogate and District, and there was York City and District. In July of 1988, AJS had purchased some of the depots back from Parkdale Holdings. There'd been a bit of a property crash, so they weren't really worth redeveloping, and it was realised that it was a bit tenuous having to rent them back all the time. You might as well just own them. So they did buy back some of the properties, and one of the depots they bought back was Malton. Going into 1989, Harrogate and District bought Harrogate Independent Travel, who'd been competing with them in Harrogate. Not, strictly speaking, relevant to Yorkshire Coastliner, but some of the vehicles later did transfer across. But all was not well in West Yorkshire, really, so in July 1989, AJS sold the main West Yorkshire operation to Yorkshire Rider, the former PTE operator in West Yorkshire. The takeover commenced. It actually came into being from the 13th of August 1989, and it included the West Yorkshire garages at Leeds, Bradford and Otley. Keighley Garage stayed with AJS and was hastily rebranded Keighley and District from August 1989, so that became a separate subsidiary as well. At around the same time, the holding company for Harrogate and District, Keighley and District, York City and District within the AJS group became known as North of England Travel Group. It was still a subsidiary of AJS. It all gets a little bit complicated. Throughout all of this upheaval, the livery on the Olympians basically stayed the same. They carried the old West Yorkshire Coastliner Venetian blind colours. The odd one started to be painted into York City and District's blue and cream livery when that became a thing in sort of 1989, early 1990, but most of them carried the old West Yorkshire livery. The single deckers that were used, whether they were Leopard dual purpose vehicles or Leyland Nationals, generally carried the West Yorkshire Tilling red and cream that they'd adopted after deregulation. As you can see in this photo of fleet number 53, as it is there, registration KUB 553V, a Plaxton Supreme bodied Leyland Leopard. York City and District did start to paint their vehicles in blue and cream livery. This one is blue and cream without fleet names. I'm guessing this is shortly after Yorkshire Coastliner had become a separate company and had taken the York City and District names off it, and it was waiting for Yorkshire Coastliner vinyls. But yeah, towards the end of 1989, etc., any single deckers on the route would have carried York City and District fleet names, and most of the double deckers were still carrying Yorkshire Coastliner from the West Yorkshire days, as we saw on 1853 and 1854 earlier on. On the 2nd of January 1990, Malton Depot was split from York City and District, and it was formed into the new Yorkshire Coastliner Company. It was split because the operations from Malton and the main 843 and its associate routes were actually profitable, whereas the rest of York City and District wasn't. It was loss making. They'd done all sorts of weird things like stop running on Sundays and things to try and turn the balance books around, and it obviously didn't happen. You know, nobody wants a 6-day-a-week bus service. It actually made things worse. So they were getting ready to sell the York operation, and therefore they split the profitable Malton operation away from it. This little Leopard, as I said, Fleet number 53, KUB 553V, is coming into Leeds Central Bus Station. And the reason for that, as I mentioned earlier on, Vicar Lane Bus Station closed in 1990, the 31st of March 1990 to be exact. So the Coastliner services were diverted to Leeds Central Bus Station, where this Leopard is coming into. By that stage, the extensions to and from Wellington Street and Bradford had been knocked off. They didn't. All services started from Leeds Central Bus Station. So we've got a little bit more of the complicated history, then we'll just bang through some photographs and have a look at some photos of Coastliner vehicles. In August 1990, York City and District, the York Depot was sold to Yorkshire Rider, so it was reunited with the main West Yorkshire operation, and it was rebranded as York City Rider. A year later, in August 1991, AJS was sold to directors Giles Fernley and Stuart Wilde, and Alan Stevenson departed the scene. And Giles Fernley and Stuart Wilde renamed it as Blazefield Holdings, or they launched a new company, Blazefield Holdings, to take over the operations. Just to finish the corporate stuff and get up to date, in January 2006, Blazefield was purchased by Transdev to form Transdev Blazefield. And then in August 2008, Topline Travel and Veolia Transport's York operations were purchased by Transdev Blazefield. They added York Pullman's local services in 2012. That was the York Pullman that was owned by K&J Logistics, who later sold the coach and contract division of it to First Group, bizarrely. But yeah, the local bus operations were bought by Transdev Blazefield in 2012, and it was formed into Transdev York. In 2018, they relaunched Transdev York as York and Country buses. Now, some Coastliner vehicles nowadays operate from York, and it's not unusual to see a Coastliner branded vehicle on a York service. But to reduce the amount of dead mileage to and from Malton, some of the main Coastliner operations are now run from the York Depot. So I just thought I'd include that little bit just to bring the story up to date and to get rid of most of the corporate stuff. So going back to 1990 and the split of Yorkshire Coastliner from the York City and District operation, Yorkshire Coastliner adopted a new fleet name underlined with a wave, as you can see on London Olympian, with Eastern Coachworks body. Fleet number 480, registered C480YWY at York Station. They carried on the old York City and District livery of blue and cream. That's the livery that they had applied to some of their Olympians, and Coastliner carried it on just with new branding. Yorkshire Rider weren't going to be using it. They were going to use their own livery of brilliant green and jonquil, as you can see on the Olympian just peeking into the shot next to it. So I'll show you a couple of quick timetables. This is part of the 1984 York area one. You can see it's got the Bridlington York Leeds and Hull York Leeds there, run jointly by East Yorkshire, West Yorkshire and Yorkshire Coastliner, as you can see at the top. And if we go to a different page, you've got the 743 Scarborough York Leeds, 842 Scarborough York Leeds and 843 Scarborough York Leeds, all run by West Yorkshire under the Yorkshire Coastline name, as you can see there. 1986 West Yorkshire branding, you've got a Leeds York composite timetable there, routes 743, 842, 843, 744, 746. You can see the West Yorkshire post deregulation branding there. This one from deregulation day on 26th of October 1986. Then we've got York City and District, this one from 1988. No mention of the Coastliner branding in there. You can see the Leeds York bit there. There was a York Scarborough as well separately. If you're wondering about Whitby, by the way, for many years the Whitby service was a separate branch from York and Malton. It didn't come through from Leeds. That was a later 1990s edition by Yorkshire Coastliner. So you can see the separate Whitby service there. And as we'll discuss, for some years Yorkshire Coastliner and Malton Depot did operate some other services apart from the main one. such as the 95 Malton to Sneinton that's on here. We've got some more York timetables. I mean, they're all much of a muchness inside. You can see the branding that was used by this point in 1990. So by the time this timetable was printed, it was a separate company, was Yorkshire Coastliner, but of course, back in those days, the lead time from printers was quite long, so it probably hadn't been finalised when the proofs were sent off to the printers. There's certainly no mention in most of the timetable that it's a separate company. However, by June 1990, there was this little timetable leaflet that had been issued with both companies' names on it, York City and District and Yorkshire Coastliner. So that indicates that York City and District was still helping out on some of the operation. And it's a summary of departures. It's not a proper laid out timetable. It's just a summary of when the buses left particular points. And it certainly confused most connections. You've got this timetable for Malton, Pickering, Whitby, marked up as York City and District, but the 81 Scagglethorpe, Malton, Sheriff Hutton, York marked as Yorkshire Coastliner, and that's in this Moors Connections booklet, which was dated August of 1990. So back to the photos. The first new vehicles bought for the standalone Yorkshire Coastliner Company arrived in May 1990. There were 5 Leyland Tigers with Plaxton Paramount 3200 bodies, numbered 431 to 435, G431 to G435 MWU. And the first of the batch, 431 G431 MWU, is seen in Leeds Central Bus Station, having arrived from Scarborough on the 843. They replaced some of the Leyland Leopards, not all of them. The Leopards soldiered on into the mid-90s, some of them did anyway. The Leopards weren't particularly old. They were only about 10 years old at that point, 1990, when these Tigers arrived. But of course the route is quite a hard route. There's a lot of fast running on the A64 between Leeds and York, and to an extent between sort of York, Malton, Scarborough, although it's not as fast a road there because it's single carriageway. But it's a long route, it's quite a hard route. There's quite a bit of stop-start through York and Malton and things like that, and into Leeds. It's not a particularly easy route on vehicles, and it does tend to pick out the men from the boys, shall we say. So the Leopards would have had a hard life, and to passengers they did seem quite dated. They still had leaf springs because the Leopard design went back to the 1960s, even though the buses themselves were only about 10 years old that were on the Coastliner services. It was a 1960s designed vehicle, and they did seem a little bit older to passengers, so you kind of understood why they wanted to start to replace them. Next new buses for the Yorkshire Coastliner operation were some of the nicest buses that I've ever travelled on. They were really, really good. They weren't anything particularly unusual for the time. They were Leyland Olympians with Northern Counties bodies. There were 6 of them. They were delivered in September and October 1992. They were fleet numbers 402 to 407 with cherished registrations K2 to K7 YCL. YCL obviously Yorkshire Coastliner Limited. And we see fleet number 405 registered K5 YCL at York Station, loading up for Scarborough. They had Cummins engines, which again wasn't particularly unusual in Olympians of that point, but they were pretty fast, it has to be said. But the seats in them were absolutely lovely. They were high backed, but they were really, really deep cushioned. They were really comfortable. I've slept in beds that weren't as comfortable as those seats. Honestly, they were absolutely amazing. The buses themselves were transferred to Keighley after a few years on the Coastliner. They worked for Keighley and District, and then they were sold to Yorkshire Traction, who were sold then to the Stagecoach Group, so they became part of Stagecoach when they bought Yorkshire Traction. And then when Stagecoach got rid of the Huddersfield depot that had been Yorkshire Traction's, they passed on to Centrebus as part of the Huddersfield Bus Company operation. So yeah, they were they travelled about quite a bit, but they were lovely, lovely buses. They were really, really comfortable to travel in. As I say, they were really quick. Note as well, they started to put branding for the main route on above the windows. So you can see there it says Leeds, Tadcaster, York, Malton, Scarborough, Bridlington and Filey. Still no mention of Whitby at this point. They presumably hadn't started running through services that regularly by this time. But they had started to do a couple a day to Bridlington route 845. That also it went through Filey on the way to Bridlington. The branding's a little bit out of sequence there. So as you can see, the branding was also added to some of the older Leyland Olympians. This is fleet number 481, C481 YWY in Leeds Central Bus Station, with the back of a Yorkshire Woolen Bristol VR just peering into the shot there. But yeah, this one's got it the right way around. It's got Filey Bridlington because that's the way the route actually went. Just to highlight what I meant about it being a hard route, we see one of the Leopards here, fleet number 468 by this point, registered KUB 668V, seen Leeds Central Bus Station in May 1993. Look at the battered paintwork on the front caused by hammering up and down the A64 basically. So as we said, by this point, Thornton Dale, Pickering and Whitby had got the direct services to Leeds. So you can see 842 Thornton Dale on the blind there. So this is about the time that they'd added Whitby into the main service rather than it being a separate operation. One of the features of the Coastliner operation was that they would get rid of some buses like Leyland Leopards, for example, and then they get busy in the summer or they take extra routes on and they get back some of the vehicles of the type that they just got rid of, not necessarily ones they'd operated before. It still happens. I'm recording this in 2025. You still find extra Volvo B9s being drafted in the summertime to run on the routes, even though a lot of the B9s that operated for Yorkshire Coastliner have been replaced. And this is a case in point. We see an older Leyland Leopard here, 484, with the sort of cherished registration, dateless registration, AEG 984A. It was new as GWU 560T to West Yorkshire in May 1979 as fleet number 2345. It was later renumbered 2588. And then after Harrogate Independent were taken over, it was transferred to them and it worked for them for a bit. But after a couple of years sort of running round Harrogate basically and doing the odd Blackpool summer service from Harrogate, it was commandeered to go to Malton and work on the Yorkshire Coastliner route. And it's seen here in York. It's not on the main route in this one, it's on the 81 that we saw the timetable of earlier on, the York Sheriff Hutton Malton service. Whilst it was with Harrogate Independent, it had a road traffic collision. It was fitted with a front end from a Plaxton Paramount. As you can see, the lower front panel is off a Paramount. The rest of it's the original Supreme front. But yeah, the grille and light area is from Paramount. It's just arriving in York. It's at the junction of Pavement and Piccadilly, having just run in from Malton on the 81 and blinded up for the return working. So the next new buses after the KYCL batch were some Volvo Olympians. The Olympian had been rebadged as a Volvo product, and they had the first Alexander Royale bodies to be produced. This bus that we're looking at now, fleet number 408, registered L8YCL, was the first production Alexander Royale. It was a Royale that I did a model review of and I went through the history of it, but basically it was an updated version of the Alexander R-Type with a new front and a restyled side as well. So two of these came. 408 arrived in October 1993, 409 didn't come until May 1994. It was delayed quite a bit. As you see in a minute, there was some detailed differences between the two of them. They were registered L8 and L9 YCL, still with the cherished registrations. And 408 seen here in the 1994 shot on a private hire working. As we said, it was the first Royale to be produced. Note it's got single piece screens both downstairs and upstairs on the front as well. So 409 when it arrived, as we said in May 1994, had two piece screens downstairs and upstairs on the front, so it was slightly different to 408. Those two buses had electronic blinds, as you can see. Most of the other buses had winder blinds, basically the old fabric blinds that wind up and down. But these had electronics, and for a period of time they were programmed. If they were going towards Leeds, they didn't show a route number. So as you can see, there's no route number because all the routes were the same between sort of Malton, York and Leeds. There wasn't any difference. So they didn't bother to just put Leeds on the blinds. Just entering Leeds Central Bus Station in a January 1995 shot. You can see the branding has been put above and below the windows now because they've also got Whitby on it. So you've got Leeds, York, Malton, Scarborough, Bridlington, Farley, so they're back to being the wrong way round again. But then you've got Eden Camp, Flamingo Land, Pickering and Whitby below the windows there as well. So next up were more Royales, the same as 409 with the split screens on the front windows. There were 422 to 425 registered M92 to M925 UYG, delivered in February of 1995. And we see 422 in this shot at Scarborough Railway Station. As you can see just about on the front grille, this batch had a little Royale crown on the grille, whereas the rest of them didn't. Note as well they've reverted to the winder type blinds rather than the electronics as well. In many respects, never quite cracked the branding because this one has got Tadcaster on it, whereas the other one didn't, but it's not got Bridlington, there's not room for it. So you've got Leeds, Tadcaster, York, Malton, Scarborough, and then finally floating about on its own there, then Edencamp, Flamingo Land, Pickering and Whitby. No mention of Bridlington, even though they quite definitely were going to Bridlington still at this point. So they went through a phase of buying single deck buses every now and again. The odd batch of single deckers would come in. Usually they weren't big enough to cope with the loads in summer times, so they tended to stop buying them, and certainly after the free concessionary travel came in the 2000s, they weren't big enough to carry the loads. But the next ones after the MUYG batch of Olympians were some Volvo B10B, so step entrance buses with right endurance bodies. New in March 1996, there were 451 to 455 and 451 to 455 HWY. And we see 451 when new at a rally, attending a rally, with a Birmingham standard behind it and a bus from North Rider who were based, I believe, in Cramlington, just north of Newcastle, next to it. A feature on the buses that started to appear in the sort of mid-90s was this map on the back of them. You can see quite a nice map. Horrendous to model, probably, I would imagine. I'm glad the Creative Master Northcore model that I reviewed actually had one printed on it already. I didn't have to add it myself, but this is the back of 451 showing the map that they did. Branding on this one a little bit different as well. It says just East Coast on it rather than picking out Scarborough and Bridlington and things as well. So yeah, it actually reads Leeds, Tadcaster, York, Castle Howard, Malton, Pickering, Whitby and East Coast. These buses were intended to do the little Castle Howard diversion on some of the 840 and 842 services. Because I believe the archway at Castle Howard wasn't high enough for double deckers to go through it, so that's why they had Castle Howard in. But again, to fit it all on, they just lost Scarborough and Bridlington and put East Coast on it. So another timetable now, the last one I'm going to show you in this one, but it's the Mo's Connections booklet for summer 1994, May to September 94. You can see the Plaxton Supreme Bodied Leyland Tiger on the front. It did operate a couple of those for a period of time. Registration VAV254X. Some other buses that were drafted in to help out. So it shows you in the mid-90s what Coastliner are operating as well as the main route. You've got the Helmsley Malton 94 there. You've got the 81 Malton Sheriff Hutton York. The 83 Malton Levening York. You've got the 95A Malton Scampston and Snainton. You've got the Malton and Norton Town Service branded as Town Link there, the 93. There's a Fridays only Malton to Levening, Route 85. And last but not least, of course, you've got the main service, Leeds, York, Malton, Scarborough, 840, 842 and 843. The Bridlington journeys are mentioned as a footnote in this timetable, not in the main timetable, but it doesn't mention that they were a separate route number, the 845.